Just light it already." The words sliced through the crisp October air as 200 students formed a suffocating circle around the school courtyard. Sophia Martinez stood motionless in the center, watching Blake Morrison dangle her worn leather backpack over a metal trash can while Kevin Walsh flicked his lighter with theatrical precision. But if anyone had looked closely, really closely, they would have noticed something peculiar about Sophia's stance. Her feet weren't planted in fear. They were positioned in perfect fighting form, weight distributed with the precision of someone who had learned that balance meant survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Riverside High School's courtyard as lunch period reached its peak chaos. Students clustered around picnic tables, their conversations creating a steady hum that would soon be shattered by what was about to unfold. Sophia Martinez had been the new girl for exactly 17 days, though it felt like 17 years. She moved through the hallways of Cedar Falls, Oregon's only high school, like a ghost, clutching that leather backpack as if it contained the most precious treasures on earth. Which, in a way, it did. Nobody at Riverside High really knew Sophia Martinez. They saw a slight girl with dark hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, clean but clearly secondhand. She never spoke unless directly asked a question, ate lunch alone on the steps near the library, and had the kind of stillness that made teachers forget she was there. What they didn't see were the calluses on her knuckles, carefully hidden under long sleeves. What they couldn't know was that those same quiet hands had earned her 23 consecutive victories in underground circuits across 3 states. The trouble had started small, the way these things always do. Sophia had made what seemed like an innocent mistake during second period chemistry. Dylan Reed, one of Blake Morrison's eager followers, had been showing off by balancing his stool on 2 legs when gravity inevitably won. He'd reached out wildly to break his fall, and his flailing hand had connected with Sophia's shoulder. Any normal 17-year-old girl would have stumbled, maybe even fallen. Instead, Sophia had done something almost imperceptible, a tiny shift in her center of gravity, a minute adjustment in her footing that allowed Dylan's push to slide past her like water off stone. Dylan had hit the floor hard while Sophia remained perfectly upright, her notebook never even shifting in her hands. To everyone watching, it looked like Dylan had simply missed his target. But Blake Morrison, sitting 3 rows back, had seen something different. He'd seen the micro-movement, the subtle way she'd redirected force that spoke of training far beyond any self-defense class offered at the local YMCA. Blake Morrison had built his reputation on reading people, on identifying threats before they could challenge his carefully constructed kingdom. And now his radar was pinging loud and clear. Blake Morrison ruled Riverside High with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. As the mayor's son and the star of a basketball team that actually had a shot at state championships, he existed in a bubble of protection that made him essentially untouchable. Teachers looked the other way when he made cutting remarks to struggling students. Administrators found excuses when parents complained about his behavior. His crew of followers, Kevin Walsh, Dylan Reed, and Ashley Kim, served as both audience and enforcement, amplifying his power through their loyal laughter and eager participation in whatever humiliation he devised. Over the past 3 years, Blake had perfected a system. He would identify students who might pose a threat to his social dominance, the too smart kids, the ones who didn't laugh at his jokes, anyone who seemed like they might resist his authority, and he would systematically break them down. Some he drove to transfer schools. Others simply learned to keep their heads down and avoid eye contact. A few had required more dramatic lessons, the kind that left lasting impressions on both the victim and any witnesses brave enough to watch. The system worked because Blake understood something fundamental about high school hierarchies. Most people were desperate to avoid being targets themselves. As long as he was picking on someone else, the crowd would not only tolerate his cruelty, but actively participate in it, grateful that the spotlight of his attention had landed elsewhere. It was a perfect ecosystem of fear and complicity, and Blake was its apex predator. But Sophia Martinez wasn't fitting the usual pattern. Most new students either tried to ingratiate themselves with the popular crowd or simply disappeared into the background until graduation. Sophia was doing neither. She wasn't seeking approval, but she also wasn't cowering. She was just there, present but not participating, watching but not engaging. And something about her stillness made Blake's instincts scream danger. The decision to target her had been strategic, not emotional. Blake needed to reassert his dominance before anyone got the wrong idea about challenging him. He needed a public demonstration that would remind everyone at Riverside High exactly how the food chain worked. And that worn leather backpack she carried everywhere seemed like the perfect leverage point. Everyone had something they cared about, something that could be used against them. For Sophia Martinez, it was obviously that beat-up bag she guarded. Like Fort Knox, what Blake didn't know was that the backpack contained more than just school supplies. Hidden in its specially modified compartments were medications that kept Sophia's 12-year-old sister alive, emergency cash that meant the difference between eating and going hungry, and photographs of a family that had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. The bag also held items that would have raised serious questions if discovered: hand wraps stained with blood that wasn't hers, fight contracts bearing the signature Phoenix, and a burner phone that connected her to a world where teenage girls weren't supposed to exist. Sophia had moved to Cedar Falls with her mother and younger sister 3 months ago, fleeing a situation in Phoenix that had become untenable. Her father's medical bills had consumed their savings. His death had eliminated their primary income. And the loan sharks he'd borrowed from to pay for experimental treatments weren't the forgiving type. The underground fighting circuit had been Sophia's solution, a way to earn money fast without asking questions or requiring documentation that a 17-year-old couldn't provide. She'd started small, taking fights in warehouse venues where desperate people bet on desperate entertainment. Her size had made her an underdog in every match, which meant the odds were always stacked against her and the payouts were substantial. When she won, and she always won. 5 years of martial arts training that had started as a father-daughter bonding activity had evolved into something much more serious when money became scarce and options became limited. The underground circuits operated in a shadow world where fighters were known only by their chosen names and personal details were nobody's business. Sophia had become the Phoenix, partly as a nod to her hometown and partly because she had a talent for rising from situations that should have destroyed her. Match after match, she'd built a reputation as someone who absorbed punishment until her opponents thought they had her beaten, then exploded into devastating counterattacks that ended fights in seconds. By the time they'd fled to Oregon, Sophia had earned enough money to secure a small apartment and cover her sister's ongoing medical expenses. The plan was simple: keep her head down, finish high school, and take fights in Portland's more lucrative venues on weekends. Cedar Falls was supposed to be a quiet place where nobody asked questions, and nobody looked too closely at a teenager who seemed older than her years. But Blake Morrison wasn't following the script. He'd noticed her, marked her as different, and decided she needed to be handled. The targeting had been subtle at first: pointed comments in the hallway, social media posts that excluded her from group projects, the kind of low-level harassment designed to test her breaking point. When Sophia had failed to react appropriately, she hadn't cried, hadn't begged for inclusion, hadn't tried to appease him, Blake had escalated. The backpack plan was meant to be his masterpiece. He would take the one thing she obviously cared about, destroy it in front of the entire school, and force her to choose between her dignity and her belongings. Either she would break down publicly, confirming his power over her, or she would try to stop him and give him an excuse to physically dominate her. It was a win-win scenario that would reinforce his position, while providing entertainment for his followers and a warning to anyone else who might be considering stepping out of line. Blake had orchestrated the whole thing like a movie director. Kevin Walsh would handle the actual destruction while Delane Reed controlled crowd access and Ashley Kim managed social media documentation. The timing was perfect. Lunch period meant maximum audience, and the courtyard's open layout ensured everyone would have a clear view of Sophia's humiliation. He'd even arranged for someone to accidentally mention the time and location on Instagram, guaranteeing that students would gather expecting a show. What Blake hadn't counted on was Sophia's background, making her impossible to intimidate through conventional means. Someone who had faced down adult men in environments where losing meant hospitalization wasn't going to be broken by high school social dynamics. Someone who fought for money that kept her family alive wasn't going to be devastated by the destruction of replaceable objects. And someone who had built her reputation on turning apparent defeat into crushing victory wasn't going to play the victim role that Blake's plan required. The confrontation had been building for days, with Blake making increasingly obvious moves to isolate and pressure Sophia. He'd convinced teachers to pair her with his friends for group projects, ensuring she was either excluded from planning or forced to do all the work herself. He'd spread rumors about her background, suggesting everything from criminal activity to family dysfunction. He'd even arranged for small accidents, spilled drinks, missing homework, mysteriously locked bathroom doors, designed to make her daily life at Riverside High as miserable as possible. Through it all, Sophia had maintained the same unsettling calm that had first caught Blake's attention. She didn't complain to teachers, didn't seek support from potential friends, didn't even acknowledge that anything unusual was happening. She simply absorbed each attack and continued moving through her days with the same measured precision that characterized everything she did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To Blake, this reaction was infuriating. To anyone who understood combat, it was terrifying. The morning of the backpack incident, Sophia had received a text on her burner phone that should have been her primary concern. Vincent Torres, her contact in the Portland underground scene, had arranged a match for the following weekend that would pay more than she'd made in her previous 5 fights combined. The opponent was a former professional boxer trying to rebuild his career through illegal venues, and the betting lines heavily favored his experience over her youth. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-reward opportunity that could set her family up for months. But as she'd walked through Riverside High's halls that morning, Sophia had sensed the change in atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she passed. Students stared more openly than usual. Ashley Kim had actually smiled at her, which was more unsettling than any direct hostility could have been. Blake's crew was moving with the purposeful energy of people executing a plan, and their barely contained excitement suggested that plan was reaching its climax. Sophia had considered staying home, claiming illness, and avoiding whatever confrontation Blake had orchestrated. But missing school meant missed assignments. Missed assignments meant questions from teachers, and questions from teachers meant attention she couldn't afford. Besides, running from high school bullies would be laughably absurd for someone who regularly faced opponents who could literally kill her if she made a mistake. So she'd gone through her morning classes with the same quiet focus she always maintained, keeping her backpack closed and her expression neutral. During third period history, she'd noticed Dylan Reed watching her with the intensity of someone memorizing details for later use. In fourth period English, Kevin Walsh had made a point of commenting on how much stuff she carried in that ratty old bag. By the time lunch arrived, Even students who normally ignored her existence were stealing glances and whispering among themselves. The trap had been elegantly simple. Ashley Kim had approached Sophia near her usual lunch spot with a friendly smile and an invitation to join a group of girls who were eating in the courtyard. The invitation was so obviously fake that Sophia had almost refused, but something in Ashley's eyes, a mixture of pity and excitement, had convinced her to play along. If Blake Morrison wanted a confrontation, avoiding it would only delay the inevitable and give him time to plan something worse. The walk to the courtyard had felt like a procession to execution. Students lined the hallways, phones already out and recording, their faces showing the mix of anticipation and revulsion that accompanied any promised spectacle. Some looked genuinely excited to see someone else become the target of Blake's attention. Others seemed uncomfortable, but unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves by intervening. A few mostly younger students who had been Blake's victims in previous years watched with the haunted expressions of people reliving their own trauma. The courtyard itself had been transformed into an arena. What should have been a normal lunch gathering had become something else entirely, with students forming concentric circles around the central area where Blake waited with Sophia's backpack already in his hands. He'd somehow gotten hold of it. During the chaos of the lunch rush, probably through one of his followers creating a distraction, while another grabbed it from her locker or table. Blake stood in the center of the space like a gladiator commanding the Colosseum, his presence drawing energy from the crowd and reflecting it back amplified. He was performing for an audience that wanted to see blood, and he had every intention of giving them a show they would remember for years. The metal trash can beside him had been dragged into position like a prop on a stage, and Kevin Walsh's lighter caught the afternoon sun like a promise of destruction. This was the moment Blake had been building toward for weeks. Every small humiliation, every calculated insult, every carefully orchestrated incident had been designed to bring them to this point, where Sophia Martinez would finally break the way everyone else had broken. She would cry, beg, possibly even get on her knees to save her precious belongings. The video would go viral, her reputation would be destroyed, and Blake's dominance would be reconfirmed in the most public way possible. What Blake Morrison couldn't have known was that he wasn't facing a typical high school student. He was facing someone who had learned to weaponize stillness, who had built a career on letting opponents underestimate her, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm while violence swirled around her. Sophia Martinez had faced down men twice Blake's size in environments where the stakes were infinitely higher than high school social status. As she stood in that circle of expectant faces, watching Blake dangle her backpack over the flames, Kevin Walsh was coaxing from his lighter, Sophia felt the familiar sensation that always preceded her best fights. Time seemed to slow down. Her breathing deepened and steadied. Her heart rate dropped to the controlled rhythm she'd trained herself to maintain under stress. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like her late father whispered the same words he'd always told her before sparring sessions. Stay calm, mi amor. Let them show you who they are before you show them who you are. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Phones rose like weapons, ready to capture whatever humiliation Blake had planned. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and teenage cruelty, while 200 students held their collective breath waiting for a show that none of them would ever forget. Blake Morrison smiled his predator's smile and prepared to destroy what he thought was just another victim. He had no idea that he was about to learn the difference between someone who bullied the weak and someone who had earned their strength through blood, sweat, and the desperate need to protect the people they loved. He was about to discover why they called her the Phoenix in places where reputation meant survival. And Sophia Martinez, standing perfectly still in the eye of the storm Blake had created, began the mental countdown that had preceded 23 consecutive victories. In venues where losing meant more than just embarrassment. 3, 2, 1. The lesson was about to begin. Sophia Martinez existed in the margins of Riverside High, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, her edges soft and indistinct to anyone who bothered looking. She wore the same rotation of thrift store clothes with the careful precision of someone who understood that appearing too poor invited pity, while appearing too put together raised questions about income sources that couldn't be answered honestly. Her jeans were always clean but showed the telltale signs of repeated washing, and her sneakers had been white once, maybe 2 years and 1,000 miles ago. The students of Cedar Falls had categorized her within the first week of her arrival, filing her away in that mental folder reserved for kids who didn't quite matter. She wasn't pretty enough to be envied, smart enough to be feared, or interesting enough to be worth knowing. She was just there, like background music in an elevator or the hum of fluorescent lights that you only noticed when it stopped. Teachers marked her present and moved on. Classmates stepped around her in hallways the way they might navigate around a piece of furniture that had always been there. What made Sophia's invisibility particularly effective was how effortlessly she maintained it. She never volunteered answers even when she clearly knew them, never initiated conversations, never drew attention to herself through either achievement or failure. Her grades hovered in the perfectly unremarkable B- range, high enough to avoid remedial attention but low enough to escape academic recognition. She completed assignments with mechanical precision, producing work that met requirements without exceeding them, as if she'd studied the exact minimum effort needed to remain unnoticed. During lunch periods, Sophia would settle onto the concrete steps near the library's side entrance, unwrapping sandwiches that were always the same: peanut butter and generic jelly on bread that came from the day-old rack at the discount grocery store. She ate with the methodical focus of someone refueling rather than enjoying, her eyes scanning the courtyard with what appeared to be boredom, but was actually the constant vigilance of someone trained to assess threats and escape routes in any environment. The other students who occupied the social periphery had tried to include her in their groups during those first awkward weeks. Emma Chun, a quiet girl who spent most of her time reading fantasy novels, had invited Sophia to join her small circle of friends who discussed books and shared elaborate theories about fictional worlds. Marcus Townsend, still recovering from his own encounters with Blake Morrison's cruelty, had offered her a place at his table, where former victims of the school's social hierarchy found safety in numbers and mutual understanding. But Sophia had politely declined each overture with the same soft-spoken explanation about preferring to eat alone, needing the quiet time to study, being too tired for conversation. Her refusals were gentle enough to avoid offense, but firm enough to discourage repeated attempts. Within a month, even the kindest students had learned to respect her obvious desire for solitude, though some still nodded in greeting when their paths crossed in the hallways. The truth was that Sophia couldn't afford friendships at Riverside High. Friends asked questions about weekends and family situations and future plans. Friends wanted to visit each other's homes and meet each other's parents and share the intimate details that bonded teenagers together. Friends would notice when she disappeared every Friday evening and returned Monday morning with bruises she couldn't explain, when her phone buzzed with messages from numbers that changed weekly, when she flinched at unexpected physical contact, in ways that suggested experiences no 17-year-old should have. More dangerously, friends might recognize the signs that Sophia had learned to hide so carefully. The way she moved through crowds without bumping into anyone, even when the hallways were packed between classes. The unconscious way she positioned herself near exits and kept her back to walls whenever possible. The split-second assessment she made of every new person she encountered, categorizing them as potential threats or harmless civilians with the automatic precision of someone who had learned that survival often depended on reading people correctly within moments of meeting them. Blake Morrison represented everything that Sophia had been trained to recognize and neutralize. He moved through the school with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. His voice always slightly too loud, his gestures always slightly too aggressive, claiming space and attention as if the world owed him both. His followers orbited around him like planets around a sun, feeding off his energy and reflecting it back in amplified forms that made the whole group more dangerous than the sum of its parts. Kevin Walsh served as Blake's primary enforcer, a stocky wrestler whose thick neck and perpetual scowl made him the perfect instrument of physical intimidation. He had the kind of controlled aggression that coaches praised in athletes, but that made everyone else instinctively step aside when he walked down hallways. Kevin spoke in grunts and gestures most of the time, letting his presence communicate threats that words might make legally actionable, and his hands always seemed to be clenched into fists even when he was relaxed. Dylan Reed filled the role of enthusiastic lieutenant, eager to prove his loyalty through increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty and devotion. He had the manic energy of someone desperate to belong, and his willingness to humiliate himself for Blake's approval made him simultaneously pathetic and dangerous. Dylan was the one who came up with creative punishments for Blake's targets, who volunteered for the riskiest aspects of their schemes, who laughed loudest at jokes that weren't funny and cheered most enthusiastically for victories that weren't his. Ashley Kim provided the group's connection to the school's social networks, her popularity among the female students giving Blake access to gossip and information that he wouldn't have obtained otherwise. She had perfected the art of delivering crushing insults with a smile, of destroying reputations through carefully planted rumors and strategic social exclusions. Ashley understood that female cruelty could be more devastating than male aggression because it operated through relationships and belonging, targeting the fundamental human need for acceptance and community. Together, they formed a machine designed to identify and eliminate anything that might threaten Blake's position at the top of Riverside High's carefully constructed hierarchy. They had perfected their system over 3 years of practice, learning to spot potential challenges before they fully developed and neutralizing them through a combination of social pressure, public humiliation, and when necessary, physical intimidation. Their success rate was perfect, and their reputation for destroying anyone who opposed them had created an atmosphere of preemptive submission that made actual confrontations rarely necessary. The system worked because it was both efficient and entertaining. Students who might have objected to obvious bullying found themselves laughing, along with elaborate pranks and social experiments. Teachers who should have intervened were presented with situations that looked like typical teenage drama rather than systematic abuse. Parents who heard complaints were told stories about personality conflicts and social misunderstandings that sounded far more reasonable than accusations of organized harassment. Blake had studied the adults in his world with the same calculating intelligence he applied to his teenage targets, learning exactly how much he could get away with before facing real consequences. His father's position as mayor provided a protective umbrella that extended beyond just political connections, creating a network of obligation and favor trading that made serious punishment unlikely. His basketball skills ensured that coaches and athletic directors had invested interests in keeping him eligible and available. His charm and good looks convinced teachers and administrators that any problems must be the result of misunderstandings rather than malicious intent. The protective bubble around Blake Morrison was so complete that he had never actually been forced to face someone who couldn't be intimidated, bought off, or socially destroyed. His experience with conflict was limited to situations where he held overwhelming advantages in size, numbers, or institutional support. He had never encountered genuine resistance because his reputation preceded him, causing potential opponents to surrender before battles even began. This inexperience with real confrontation had created a dangerous blind spot in Blake's understanding of the world. He assumed that everyone operated according to the same social rules that governed Riverside High, that reputation and connections could overcome any challenge, that the threat of public humiliation was sufficient to control anyone's behavior. He had never met someone who existed outside those systems, someone for whom high school hierarchies were irrelevant distractions from more serious concerns. Sophia Martinez had learned about conflict in environments where reputation meant nothing and connections couldn't protect you. She had faced opponents who didn't care about her age, gender, or background, who were motivated by money rather than social status, who would continue attacking until they were physically incapable of continuing. Every Friday night for the past 2 years, she had entered spaces where the only thing that mattered was her ability to remain standing when the violence stopped. The underground fighting circuits that Sophia navigated operated in a shadow economy where desperation drove both participants and spectators. Fighters came from everywhere and nowhere, united only by their need for money that couldn't be earned through legitimate means. Some were former athletes whose careers had ended in scandal or injury. Others were working-class adults trying to pay medical bills or keep their families housed. A few were military veterans who couldn't transition to civilian life, who found in illegal combat the intensity and purpose that nothing else provided. The venues changed constantly to avoid law enforcement attention, shifting between abandoned warehouses, closed gyms, private clubs, and rural properties where screaming wouldn't attract unwanted attention. The crowds were equally diverse, ranging from wealthy thrill seekers looking for entertainment that money couldn't buy legally, to desperate gamblers chasing odds that legitimate sports couldn't provide, to fellow fighters scouting potential opponents and learning new techniques through observation. Sophia had entered this world through Vincent Torres, a former boxer whose own career had ended when he'd refused to throw a fight that would have made other people rich. Vincent operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal, legitimate and underground, serving as a connector who brought together fighters and opportunities while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific nature of those connections. He had found Sophia through a combination of desperation and intuition, recognizing something in her training and temperament that suggested she could survive in environments that destroyed most people. The progression from desperate teenager to underground champion had been gradual and terrifying. Sophia's first fight had been against another girl, roughly her own age and size, in a warehouse venue where the makeshift ring was surrounded by men who smelled like alcohol and violence. She had won through a combination of superior training and pure survival instinct, earning $300 that felt like a fortune until she realized how much her sister's medical bills actually cost. Each subsequent fight had taught her something new about herself and about the world she had entered. She learned that size and strength mattered less than technique and endurance, that intimidation was a tool that could be turned against itself, that the capacity for violence existed within her in ways that would have horrified the person she had been before her father's death. She also learned that winning created its own problems, attracting attention from organizers who wanted to exploit her success and opponents who saw defeating her as a path to their own advancement. The persona of the Phoenix had emerged as a practical necessity. Underground fighters were expected to maintain anonymity for legal protection, but they also needed identities that could build reputations and attract betting interest. Sophia had chosen the name partly as a tribute to her hometown and partly because it captured something essential about her fighting style, the way she absorbed punishment that would have finished other fighters and then exploded into devastating counterattacks that ended matches decisively. Her signature technique had developed through a combination of formal training and desperate improvisation. During her early years learning martial arts with her father, Sophia had shown an unusual aptitude for defensive movements, an ability to read incoming attacks and redirect their energy rather than simply blocking or avoiding them. In underground venues, this skill had evolved into something more dangerous, a way of luring opponents into overcommitting to attacks and then punishing them catastrophically for their aggression. The psychological aspect of fighting had proven as important as the physical techniques. Sophia had learned to project an aura of calm vulnerability that encouraged opponents to underestimate her capabilities, to assume that her youth and size made her an easy target for quick victories. By the time they realized their mistake, she had usually gathered enough information about their fighting patterns to dismantle them systematically. 23 consecutive victories had established the Phoenix as a legend in underground circuits. Across 3 states, promoters competed to book her for their events, knowing that her presence guaranteed increased betting activity and crowd excitement. Opponents requested matches with her, both for the money that defeating her would bring, and for the reputation that would come with ending her winning streak. She had become the measuring stick against which other fighters judged themselves, the milestone that separated legitimate contenders from ambitious pretenders. The money from fighting had transformed Sophia's family situation from desperate to merely precarious. Her younger sister's medical treatments were covered, their rent was paid through the end of the year, and they had enough saved to handle minor emergencies without resorting to predatory loans or charity. But the expenses were ongoing and increasing, and the underground circuits were becoming more dangerous as her reputation attracted both better opponents and more serious criminal attention. Vincent had been pressuring her to take fights against adult men, matches that would pay exponentially. More, but that carried risks she wasn't sure she could manage. The physical advantages her male opponents would possess were less concerning than the psychological toll of crossing lines that felt fundamental to her identity. Fighting other teenagers in underground venues felt like an extreme extension of competitive sports. Fighting grown men for the entertainment of criminals felt like something else entirely, something that might change her in ways that couldn't be undone. The delicate balance of her double life required constant vigilance and careful planning. Her mother knew that Sophia had found a way to earn money for the family, but believed it involved tutoring and odd jobs for neighbors rather than illegal combat. Her sister was too young and too sick to ask detailed questions about why their financial situation had suddenly improved. Teachers and classmates at Riverside High saw only what Sophia allowed them to see, the carefully constructed image of a withdrawn but unremarkable transfer student. Maintaining that image required Sophia to hide injuries that sometimes took weeks to heal completely, to explain away phone calls from numbers that changed frequently, to account for absences and exhaustion that had nothing to do with academic pressures. She had become expert at applying makeup to conceal bruises, at moving in ways that didn't reveal soreness or stiffness, at maintaining the same neutral expression whether she was sitting in chemistry class or being threatened by opponents who outweighed her by 60 pounds. The isolation this required was perhaps the heaviest price she paid for her underground success. Sophia couldn't share her victories with anyone, couldn't seek comfort after defeats, couldn't even acknowledge the existence of the world where she had found both purpose and income. She carried the weight of her secret life alone, processing both its triumphs and its horrors without support or understanding from the people around her. The irony was that Sophia had become exactly the kind of person that Blake Morrison claimed to be. She was genuinely dangerous, legitimately tough, and professionally successful in an arena where those qualities mattered more than social connections or family wealth. But she wore her strength like a hidden weapon, revealing it only when absolutely necessary and only to the degree required to handle specific threats. Blake broadcast his supposed toughness like a marketing campaign, using it to intimidate people who couldn't fight back and building his reputation on victories over opponents who had never been given a real chance. The confrontation that was building between them represented a collision between two completely different understandings of power and conflict. Blake saw fighting as theater, a performance designed to establish dominance and entertain audiences. Sophia understood it as problem-solving, a tool for protecting what mattered when other options had been exhausted. Blake had never been in a real fight where his safety was genuinely threatened. Sophia had never been in a fake fight where the outcome was predetermined by social expectations rather than physical capabilities. The backpack that Blake had chosen as his weapon against her contained items that represented both sides of Sophia's existence. Her school notebooks and textbooks occupied the main compartment, alongside the carefully wrapped medications that kept her sister stable. Hidden in specially modified pockets were fight contracts bearing the Phoenix signature, emergency cash and denominations that suggested its illegal origins, and hand wraps that had absorbed the blood and sweat of 2 years' worth of underground combat. There were also photographs, the kind that people carried before smartphones made everything digital and temporary. Pictures of her family when they had been whole and happy, when her father's illness was still just a minor health concern, rather than a death sentence, when the future had seemed predictable and manageable. Those photographs represented the life that Sophia was fighting to preserve, and the people who depended on her success, in ways that had nothing to do with high school social dynamics. Blake Morrison had chosen his target carefully, but he had chosen it based on incomplete information and flawed assumptions. He saw a quiet girl with an old backpack and concluded that destroying her possessions would destroy her spirit. He had no way of knowing that the girl he was threatening had already lost everything that could be taken from her, that she had rebuilt herself from those losses into something far more dangerous than he could imagine, that his elaborate plan to humiliate her was about to become the catalyst for his own destruction. The crowd gathering in the courtyard sensed that something significant was about to happen, but they understood it in terms of Riverside High's usual social theater. They expected to see another victim broken by Blake's systematic cruelty, another demonstration of the natural order that kept their own position secure. They had no context for understanding what they were actually about to witness, the moment when a predator who had never faced real opposition encountered someone who had built their life around surviving actual violence. Sophia stood in the center of the circle, watching Blake dangle her backpack over the flames, and felt the familiar transformation that preceded every fight. Her breathing deepened into the rhythm that her body associated with combat. Her vision sharpened as adrenaline heightened her perceptions without compromising her judgment. Her muscles relaxed into the loose readiness that allowed for explosive movement, while conserving energy for the duration of whatever conflict was about to unfold. The students surrounding them were recording everything, their phones capturing what they thought would be social media entertainment, but what was actually about to become evidence of the moment when Blake Morrison's carefully constructed kingdom began to crumble. They pressed closer, eager for the show they had been promised, unaware that they were about to learn the difference between performed violence and the real thing. Blake smiled his predator's smile and prepared to light the fire that would consume what he believed was just another victim's treasured belongings. He had orchestrated this moment perfectly, gathering the largest possible audience for what he intended to be a defining demonstration of his power and Sophia's powerlessness. Every detail had been planned to maximize her humiliation and his triumph, from the symbolic destruction of her possessions to the viral video that would cement his reputation and destroy hers. What Blake Morrison could not have anticipated was that he wasn't facing someone who could be broken by the loss of material objects or the judgment of peers. He was facing someone who had already been broken by circumstances far beyond anything he could inflict, who had rebuilt herself from those pieces into something that could survive and flourish in environments where his advantages meant nothing. He was about to learn that real strength didn't come from never being knocked down, but from getting back up every time and continuing to fight for the people and principles that mattered. The lighter flicked in Kevin Walsh's hand, its small flame dancing in the autumn air like a promise of destruction. 200 students held their breath, phones raised and recording, waiting for the entertainment they had been guaranteed. and Sophia Martinez, standing perfectly still in the eye of the storm that Blake Morrison had created, began the internal countdown that had preceded 23 consecutive victories in places where losing meant more than social embarrassment. The education of Blake Morrison was about to begin, though he would be the last person in the courtyard to understand what was happening to him. Blake Morrison had constructed his empire at Riverside High with the methodical precision of a corporate strategist, understanding that true power came not from random acts of cruelty, but from systematic control that made resistance seem impossible. His dominion extended far beyond the obvious territories of basketball courts and cafeteria tables, reaching into the invisible networks that governed teenage social life with the same thoroughness that his father applied to municipal politics. The foundation of Blake's power rested on a carefully cultivated relationship with the adult authority figures who theoretically controlled the school environment. Principal Johnson had watched Blake grow up through the Cedar Falls youth sports leagues, had attended barbecues at the Morrison family home, had accepted generous donations to various school programs from Blake's father's construction company. When complaints arose about Blake's behavior, they filtered through layers of personal relationship and mutual obligation that transformed serious allegations into minor misunderstandings that could be resolved through brief conversations and promises of improved conduct. Coach Stevens represented an even more powerful ally in Blake's network of protection. The basketball program at Riverside High had achieved unprecedented success during Blake's tenure, advancing to state tournaments for the first time in the school's history and generating the kind of community pride that translated directly into political capital for administrators. Stevens understood that his own career prospects were intimately connected to Blake's athletic performance, creating an incentive structure that made protecting his star player from consequences feel like a professional necessity rather than an ethical compromise. The symbiotic relationship between Blake and his protectors had evolved over years of mutual benefit and shared investment. Blake delivered the victories that made adults look good, and those adults ensured that his extracurricular activities never interfered with his availability for games or practices. When parents called to complain about their children being bullied, those calls were routed through administrative channels that had been designed to minimize disruption rather than maximize justice. Blake's understanding of this protective ecosystem was sophisticated and strategic. He knew exactly how much damage he could inflict before crossing lines that would force his adult allies to abandon him. He had learned to frame his cruelty in language that suggested character building rather than sadistic entertainment, describing his systematic humiliation of weaker students as efforts to help them develop resilience and social skills. When direct intimidation was necessary, he delegated the actual violence to subordinates like Kevin Walsh, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that his orders were carried out with appropriate ruthlessness. The administrative machinery that enabled Blake's reign had been refined through 3 years of successful cover-ups and strategic misdirection. Incident reports were filed in ways that emphasized mutual responsibility rather than clear victimization. Security footage experienced convenient technical difficulties during critical moments. Witness testimony was collected through processes that discouraged detailed accounts and encouraged vague generalizations that couldn't support serious disciplinary action. Mrs. Henderson, the guidance counselor who should have been advocating for vulnerable students, had been effectively neutralized through a combination of overwhelming caseloads and administrative pressure to focus on college preparation rather than social intervention. When students approached her with complaints about bullying, she was required to follow protocols that prioritized mediation and reconciliation over protection and accountability. The few counselors who had attempted to challenge Blake's behavior directly had found their employment situations becoming increasingly precarious, their professional reputations questioned through whisper campaigns that Blake's father orchestrated. With the same efficiency he applied to municipal contracts, The student body itself had been transformed into an extension of Blake's enforcement apparatus through carefully calibrated applications of reward and punishment. Students who aligned themselves with Blake's agenda found themselves included in social events, protected from targeting by other predators, and granted access to privileges that made their high school experience significantly more pleasant. Those who opposed him or even failed to support him enthusiastically discovered that their social lives could be destroyed through coordinated campaigns of exclusion, rumor spreading, and strategic humiliation. Blake had mastered the art of collective responsibility, ensuring that his cruelest acts involved multiple participants who became invested in maintaining the silence that protected them all from consequences. When he orchestrated the destruction of a student's art project, he made sure that a dozen people contributed to the vandalism. When he organized campaigns of social exclusion, he distributed the targeting across multiple platforms and social circles until no single person could be held accountable for the cumulative damage. When he arranged for students to be physically intimidated, he used elaborate chains of communication that obscured the source of orders while ensuring their faithful execution. The sophistication of Blake's system extended to his use of technology and social media as weapons of control and surveillance. He had cultivated networks of informants who monitored online conversations, reported on private communications, and tracked the social movements of potential targets. Instagram posts were scrutinized for signs of dissent or independence. Snapchat communications were screenshot and archived for potential future use. Text message conversations were infiltrated through strategic friendships that gave Blake access to information that should have remained private. Ashley Kim served as the primary architect of Blake's digital dominance, her natural facility with social media platforms, making her invaluable in campaigns that destroyed reputations through carefully timed releases of embarrassing information. She understood the algorithms that determined which content gained viral traction and which disappeared into obscurity, allowing her to amplify humiliating moments while suppressing any evidence that might reflect poorly on Blake's crew. Her phone contained screenshots and recordings that represented years of accumulated leverage over dozens of students, a digital arsenal that could destroy social lives with surgical precision. The economic dimensions of Blake's power were less visible but equally important in maintaining his dominance. His father's construction company employed the parents of several Riverside High students, creating financial dependencies that translated directly into social control. Families who relied on Morrison Construction for employment learned to discourage their children from challenging Blake's authority, understanding that teenage social conflicts could have adult economic consequences that affected mortgage payments and college savings. Blake had also established himself as a gatekeeper for various forms of teenage employment and opportunity within Cedar Falls. Summer jobs, athletic team positions, academic recommendations, and social invitations all flowed through networks that Blake influenced directly or indirectly. Students who wanted access to these resources learned to demonstrate appropriate loyalty and submission, while those who challenged his authority found themselves systematically excluded from opportunities that could improve their circumstances. The psychological infrastructure supporting Blake's reign was perhaps the most insidious aspect of his system. He had successfully convinced most of Riverside High's student body that his dominance was inevitable and resistance was futile, creating an atmosphere of learned helplessness that made opposition seem not just dangerous but pointless. Students internalized the idea that Blake's cruelty was a natural law rather than a choice, that challenging him would only result in worse treatment without any possibility of meaningful change. This psychological conditioning was reinforced through ritualized demonstrations of power that served as both entertainment and education for the student body. Blake's public humiliations of selected targets weren't random acts of violence, but carefully choreographed performances designed to reinforce his position. while providing vicarious satisfaction for spectators who were grateful not to be the focus of his attention. Each incident served as both punishment for the immediate victim and warning for potential future challengers. The documentation of these performances through social media created permanent records that could be referenced. Whenever Blake's dominance was questioned, students who might have forgotten the details of specific incidents could access videos that reminded them exactly what happened to people who defied the established order. The viral nature of particularly brutal humiliations ensured that Blake's reputation extended beyond Riverside High into the broader Cedar Falls community, making his power portable and persistent. Blake's crew functioned as extensions of his will, each member contributing specialized skills that made the overall operation more effective and more terrifying. Kevin Walsh provided the physical intimidation that made direct confrontation seem suicidal for most students. His wrestling background and obvious willingness to use violence created an aura of menace that surrounded Blake's group, making even casual conversations feel like potential preludes to assault. Kevin's presence at Blake's side served as a constant reminder that disagreements could escalate to physical conflict without warning. Dylan Reed contributed manic energy and creative sadism that kept Blake's campaigns of harassment fresh and unpredictable. His desperate need for acceptance made him willing to cross lines that others might hesitate to approach, and his theatrical personality transformed cruelty into entertainment that spectators found compelling rather than merely disturbing. Dylan's suggestions often provided the spark that transformed routine bullying into viral content, his instinct for drama ensuring that Blake's victims suffered in ways that were both memorable and shareable. Ashley Kim's role as social media strategist and reputation manager made her arguably the most dangerous member of Blake's inner circle. Her understanding of how information flowed through teenage networks allowed her to plant rumors that would metastasize into accepted facts, to coordinate harassment campaigns that appeared organic rather than orchestrated, and to document humiliations in ways that maximized viral potential while minimizing legal liability. Ashley's phone contained enough compromising material to destroy dozens of social lives, making her both invaluable ally and terrifying enemy. The broader ecosystem supporting Blake's dominance included secondary figures who provided intelligence, access, and specialized services that enhanced his operational capabilities. Student government representatives ensured that Blake's interests were protected in policy discussions. Academic achievers provided homework assistance and test preparation that kept Blake eligible for athletics despite his limited intellectual capabilities. Social influencers amplified his messaging and suppressed dissenting voices through coordinated campaigns of support and attack. Blake had also cultivated relationships with students from rival schools, creating networks that extended his influence beyond Riverside High's borders. These connections allowed him to coordinate harassment that followed targets home, to access information about students' activities outside school hours, and to ensure that his reputation preceded him to social events and athletic competitions. Throughout the region, the reach of his power made escape impossible for his victims, who discovered that changing schools or avoiding Riverside High events didn't provide relief from his attention. The financial resources available to Blake through his family's wealth amplified every other aspect of his power. He could afford technology that gave him advantages in surveillance and communication. He could host parties and events that served as both recruitment tools and loyalty tests. He could provide benefits to supporters and inflict economic consequences on opponents through strategic spending and boycotts. His access to money made him effectively immune to the kind of resource constraints that limited other teenagers' ability to sustain long-term campaigns of harassment. Perhaps most importantly, Blake's financial advantages allowed him to operate with a safety net that made risk-taking easier and consequences less meaningful. When his actions resulted in property damage, his family's insurance and legal resources ensured that victims were compensated while he faced minimal accountability. When his behavior threatened his athletic eligibility, private tutors and academic support systems kept him qualified for competition. When legal problems arose, expensive attorneys transformed serious charges into minor infractions that disappeared from official records. The cumulative effect of these various power sources was to create an environment where challenging Blake Morrison seemed not just dangerous but impossible. Students who might have possessed the individual courage to resist his authority were isolated from potential allies and overwhelmed by the systematic nature of his dominance. Teachers who recognized the injustice of his behavior were constrained by administrative pressures and professional vulnerabilities that made intervention seem career-threatening. Parents who wanted to protect their children discovered that the adult networks supporting Blake were more powerful and better organized than their individual complaints. Blake's understanding of his own invulnerability had evolved through years of successful operations against increasingly ambitious targets. He had learned that there were no effective checks on his behavior as long as he maintained the support of key adult authorities and avoided crossing lines that would force his protectors to abandon him. This knowledge had made him progressively more confident and more cruel, secure in the understanding that resistance was both futile and ultimately self-destructive for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. The systematic nature of Blake's cruelty was perhaps its most psychologically devastating aspect. Students who became his targets discovered that their suffering was not the result of random misfortune or temporary conflict, but part of a deliberate campaign designed to destroy their social lives and emotional stability. The knowledge that their humiliation served a strategic purpose rather than emerging from spontaneous anger made the experience more traumatic and more difficult to process or overcome. Blake had perfected techniques for identifying students who might pose threats to his dominance before they fully developed the confidence or capabilities that could challenge him. He watched for signs of leadership potential, academic achievement, athletic talent, or social influence that might eventually compete with his own position. Once identified, these potential rivals were subjected to preemptive campaigns designed to undermine their development and eliminate them as future threats. The efficiency of this targeting system meant that Riverside High had been systematically drained of the kind of strong personalities who might have provided alternative leadership or organized resistance to Blake's regime. Students learned to hide their capabilities and minimize their achievements to avoid attracting his attention, creating an atmosphere where excellence was discouraged and mediocrity was rewarded. The long-term effect was to create a student body that was collectively weaker and more easily controlled. Blake's power had also corrupted the social dynamics among students who were not directly involved in his activities. The constant threat of becoming his target created an atmosphere of paranoia and competition where students were incentivized to demonstrate their loyalty through participation in attacks on designated victims. Friendships became strategic alliances rather than emotional connections, and social interactions were filtered through calculations about their potential impact on each person's standing in Blake's hierarchy. The normalization of Blake's cruelty had reached the point where many students genuinely believed that his behavior represented natural social dynamics rather than artificial systems of oppression. They had internalized the idea that strength should dominate weakness, that popular students deserved privileges denied to others, and that resistance to established hierarchies was both futile and morally questionable. This ideological capture ensured that Blake's power was supported not just by fear, but by sincere conviction among many of his subjects. Standing in the courtyard with Sophia Martinez's backpack dangling over Kevin Walsh's lighter, Blake Morrison represented the culmination of years of careful construction and systematic oppression. He commanded not just the immediate attention of 200 students, but the accumulated power of administrative protection, parental influence, economic leverage, technological surveillance, and psychological conditioning that made his dominance seem as natural and permanent as gravity itself. Every aspect of his position had been designed to make exactly this moment possible, where he could destroy someone's treasured possessions in front of the entire school while confident that no meaningful consequences would follow. The crowd surrounding him existed to validate his power. The phones recording the incident would spread his influence, and the victim standing before him would be broken in ways that served as both entertainment and education for everyone watching. Blake Morrison had never faced a situation where his elaborate systems of protection and control were insufficient to guarantee victory. He had never encountered someone who operated outside the social, economic, and political networks that formed the foundation of his power. He had never confronted an opponent who possessed capabilities that rendered his advantages irrelevant and his threats meaningless. He was about to learn the difference between power that was built on fear and power that was earned through strength. He was about to discover what happened when someone who had spent years perfecting the art of systematic oppression met someone who had spent years perfecting the art of survival against impossible odds. The education of Blake Morrison was about to begin, and like all his previous educational experiences, it would be comprehensive, memorable, and utterly transformative. The confrontation between Blake Morrison and Sophia Martinez had its roots in a moment 3 weeks earlier that neither of them had recognized as significant at the time. October mornings in Cedar Falls carried the crisp promise of winter, and Sophia had been running on 3 hours of sleep after a particularly brutal fight in Portland that had ended with her opponent requiring emergency dental work and her earning a purse that would cover her sister's medication for the next 2 months. The exhaustion that clouded her judgment that Tuesday morning was the cumulative result of maintaining 2 incompatible lives with mathematical precision. Monday through Friday, she was Sophia Martinez, invisible transfer student who sat in the back of classrooms and ate lunch alone while memorizing homework, assignments that seemed trivial compared to the life and death calculations that occupied her weekends. Friday nights through Sunday afternoons, she transformed into the Phoenix, underground fighting sensation whose reputation was built on an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment before delivering counterattacks that ended careers. The schedule was grinding her down in ways that she couldn't admit to anyone, least of all herself. Sleep became a luxury that she rationed carefully between study sessions and training regimens. Meals were fuel rather than pleasure, consumed with the mechanical efficiency of someone who understood nutrition as performance enhancement rather than social activity. Even her relationships with her mother and sister had become strategic communications, designed to maintain their belief that she was succeeding through conventional means rather than risking her life for money in venues where medical attention was provided by veterinarians who didn't ask questions. That particular Tuesday had started badly when her alarm failed to sound, forcing her to skip her usual preschool training session in favor of desperate attempts to complete chemistry homework that she had abandoned the previous evening in favor of ice baths and injury assessment. The homework itself was straightforward, but her hands had been shaking from residual adrenaline and her concentration had been compromised by the kind of hypervigilance that followed violent encounters with people who had genuinely tried to cause her permanent harm. Arriving at Riverside High 20 minutes late had required explanations that she couldn't provide honestly, forcing her to invent a story about family emergencies that raised sympathetic questions she didn't want to answer. Her chemistry teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, had accepted her tardy slip with the kind of concerned expression that suggested follow-up conversations about home situations and available resources. Sophia had nodded appropriately while internally calculating how many additional lies she would need to construct to prevent well-meaning adults from investigating circumstances that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The hallway incident that would eventually lead to her standing in the courtyard, watching Blake threaten her possessions, had occurred during the transition between third and fourth periods. When Riverside High's corridors became rivers of teenage chaos that challenged even experienced navigators. Sophia had been moving against the current of students flowing toward the cafeteria, her backpack heavy with textbooks that she carried everywhere because her locker had been vandalized twice since her arrival, and she couldn't risk leaving important items unprotected. Dylan Reed had been performing for an audience of admirers, demonstrating his loyalty to Blake Morrison through increasingly elaborate displays of casual cruelty directed at anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. His target that day had been Marcus Thompson, a sophomore whose previous encounters with Blake's crew had left him jumpy and defensive in ways that made him even more appealing as a victim. Dylan had been trailing Marcus through the hallways, providing running commentary on his appearance, family situation, and social prospects that drew laughter from spectators and tears from his target. The collision between Dylan and Sophia had been inevitable given the chaos of the hallway and Dylan's focus on his performance rather than navigation. He had been gesturing wildly while describing Marcus's perceived inadequacies when his backward momentum had carried him directly into Sophia's path. Under normal circumstances, the impact would have sent both students stumbling, probably resulting in dropped books, scattered papers, and the kind of minor embarrassment that characterized routine teenage interactions. But Sophia Martinez was not operating under normal circumstances. Her body was still processing the chemical aftermath of Saturday night's fight, her nervous system calibrated for threats that went far beyond social awkwardness. When Dylan's considerable mass had collided with her from behind, her response had been automatic and devastating. Without conscious thought, she had shifted her weight distribution and adjusted her center of gravity in ways that transformed Dylan's aggressive momentum into a demonstration of basic physics. The result had been spectacular in its efficiency. Dylan Reed, all 200 pounds of him, had found himself airborne for a moment that seemed to stretch into geological time. His landing had been neither graceful nor quiet, involving contact with lockers that rang like church bells and a final impact with the floor that had silenced conversations 20 feet away. When the dust settled, literally and figuratively, Dylan had been flat on his back, staring at ceiling tiles while Sophia stood exactly where she had been, her backpack intact and her expression unchanged. The immediate aftermath had been chaos. As students processed what they had witnessed, some had rushed to help Dylan, whose pride was more damaged than his body, but who was making sounds that suggested serious injury. Others had focused on Sophia, expecting tears or apologies or some acknowledgement that a terrible accident had occurred. Instead, they had encountered the same neutral calm that characterized all her interactions, as if sending a much larger person flying through the air was no more remarkable than solving a math problem or completing a reading assignment. Dylan himself had been the most confused by the encounter. His experience with physical confrontations was limited to situations where he held overwhelming advantages in size, numbers, or institutional support. The idea that someone could neutralize his aggression through technique rather than superior force was outside his conceptual framework. As his friends helped him to his feet and brushed debris from his clothing, Dylan had struggled to construct a narrative that preserved his reputation while accounting for what had obviously happened. The story that emerged from Dylan's confused recounting was that Sophia Martinez had somehow gotten lucky, that his fall had been the result of unfortunate timing rather than deliberate action. His audience had been eager to accept this explanation, because alternatives were too disturbing to contemplate. The idea that the quiet transfer student possessed capabilities that could embarrass one of Blake Morrison's lieutenants challenged assumptions about power and hierarchy that formed the foundation of Riverside High's social structure. But Blake Morrison had not been satisfied with Dylan's explanation. His position at the apex of the school's food chain had been earned through careful observation and strategic thinking rather than mere physical intimidation. While his followers had been content to dismiss the incident as accidental, Blake had recognized patterns that suggested something more significant had occurred. The way Sophia had maintained her balance while Dylan flew through the air, the complete absence of surprise or fear in her reaction, the mechanical precision with which she had continued toward her destination as if nothing unusual had happened. Blake's experience with violence was limited, but not non-existent. His wrestling background had taught him to recognize the difference between accidents and applications of technique. His basketball training had shown him how small adjustments in timing and positioning could produce dramatic results. His 3 years of systematically bullying other students had given him extensive experience in reading fear and submission, making Sophia's emotional absence particularly noteworthy. More concerning for Blake was the reaction of other students who had witnessed the encounter. While most had accepted Dylan's version of events, a few had been asking questions that suggested they had seen something that contradicted the official narrative. Emma Chun, the quiet girl who spent most of her time reading, had been heard wondering aloud how someone Sophia's size could remain standing while someone Dylan's size went flying. Marcus Thompson, who should have been grateful for any distraction from his own persecution, had been studying Sophia with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The existence of alternative interpretations threatened the carefully maintained fiction that Blake's crew was composed of naturally superior individuals whose dominance was inevitable and permanent. If Sophia Martinez could neutralize Dylan, read through technique rather than luck, what did that suggest about the actual capabilities of Blake's other opponents? If a quiet transfer student could possess skills that rendered size and aggression irrelevant, what other hidden threats might be lurking in Riverside High's apparently docile student body? Blake's decision to target Sophia had been strategic rather than emotional, designed to eliminate a potential threat before it could fully develop. But his approach had been shaped by his experience with previous victims, all of whom had operated within the social and economic systems that Blake controlled. His standard tactics involved identifying something that his target valued and threatening to destroy it, forcing them to choose between their dignity and their possessions, their privacy and their safety, their individual welfare and their families. Security. The backpack had seemed like the perfect leverage point because Sophia guarded it with obvious intensity. Blake had observed her for weeks, noting how she never let it out of her sight, how she positioned herself to protect it, even when eating lunch or participating in group activities. The bag was clearly important to her in ways that went beyond its practical utility, making it an ideal target for someone who specialized in destroying what people cared about most. Blake's plan had been elegant in its simplicity. He would take the backpack publicly, threaten to destroy it in front of the largest possible audience, and force Sophia to choose between her precious possessions and her social standing. Either she would beg for mercy, confirming his power over her and demonstrating to everyone else that even mysterious transfer students were ultimately subject to his authority, or she would try to stop him and provide justification for more serious retaliation. The timing had been calculated to maximize impact and minimize interference. The courtyard during lunch period provided the perfect venue for a demonstration that would be witnessed by hundreds of students and documented by dozens of phones. The presence of Kevin Walsh and Ashley Kim ensured that any resistance would be overwhelmed by superior numbers and more aggressive tactics. The involvement of Dylan Reed, despite his recent embarrassment, would allow Blake to reassert control over his lieutenant while proving that the hallway incident had been meaningless. Blake had also considered the likely responses from adult authorities and concluded that they would be manageable through his usual channels of influence and misdirection. The destruction of another student's property could be framed as a prank gone wrong rather than systematic bullying. The emotional distress caused to his target could be dismissed as adolescent drama rather than calculated cruelty. The viral documentation of the incident could be presented as accidental rather than orchestrated, with Blake himself portrayed as a victim of social media rather than its architect. The systematic nature of Blake's planning reflected his understanding that successful bullying required the same strategic thinking as any other form of warfare. Targets had to be selected based on vulnerability rather than convenience. Attacks had to be timed for maximum impact and minimum accountability. Audiences had to be managed to ensure that they interpreted events in ways that supported rather than undermined the aggressor's narrative. Authorities had to be prevented from intervening through combinations of misdirection, social pressure, and institutional capture. What Blake had not anticipated was that his carefully constructed plan was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about both his target and his own position. Sophia Martinez was not a typical Riverside High student who could be controlled through social pressure and material threats. She was someone who had rebuilt her life from complete devastation, who had learned to find strength in circumstances that would have destroyed most people, who had discovered that real power came from the ability to protect what mattered rather than the ability to destroy what others valued. More importantly, Blake's plan assumed that the systems protecting his authority would continue to function when challenged by someone who operated outside their sphere of influence. His experience with resistance had been limited to students who depended on the same social, economic, and institutional networks that Blake controlled. He had never faced someone whose strength came from sources that his power structure could not reach, whose motivations transcended the teenage concerns that his tactics were designed to exploit. The backpack that Blake had chosen as his weapon against Sophia contained items that represented both the vulnerability and the strength that he had failed to understand. The medications hidden in its secret compartments were indeed precious to her, but their destruction would only delay rather than prevent her ability to care for her sister. The cash concealed in its modified pockets was significant, but her underground fighting career provided access to more money than Blake's allowance could match. The photographs tucked into its protective sleeves were irreplaceable, but the people they depicted had already survived losses that made high school humiliation seem trivial. Most importantly, the backpack also contained evidence of a life that Blake's investigations had completely missed. Fight contracts bearing the Phoenix's signature, hand wraps stained with the blood of opponents who had underestimated her capabilities, emergency contact information for people who operated outside the law but inside codes of honor that made Blake's casual cruelty seem pathetic by comparison. The bag was not just a collection of personal items, but a portal to a world where Blake Morrison's advantages meant nothing and his threats were as empty as his character. As the crowd gathered in the courtyard and Blake prepared to demonstrate his dominance over what he believed was just another victim, he was actually orchestrating his own destruction. Every phone recording the incident would capture not just Sophia's supposed humiliation, but the moment when Blake Morrison learned that real strength was measured not by the pain you could inflict on others, but by the pain you could absorb while protecting what mattered most. The education of Blake Morrison was about to begin, and like all effective education, it would be comprehensive, memorable, and permanently transformative. He had spent 3 years building a reputation based on the systematic destruction of people who couldn't fight back. He was about to discover what happened when someone who had spent years learning to fight back decided that the time for hiding was over. The lighter flickered in Kevin Walsh's hand like a promise of destruction, but the real fire was already burning in Sophia Martinez's eyes as she watched Blake Morrison prepare to cross a line that would transform him from predator to prey. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and teenage cruelty, but it also carried something else, the electricity that preceded storms and the tension that preceded revelations that changed everything. 200 students pressed closer, eager for the entertainment they had been promised, unaware that they were about to witness not the destruction of another victim, but the birth of a legend. The quiet transfer student who had spent weeks hiding in plain sight was about to show them what real strength looked like when it stopped pretending to be weak. The backpack dangled over the flames like a sacrificial offering, but the real sacrifice Being prepared was Blake Morrison's carefully constructed kingdom. He had built his power on the systematic destruction of people who couldn't destroy him in return. He was about to learn that some people could not only destroy him, but would do so with the same clinical efficiency that they applied to every other problem that threatened what they loved. The countdown in Sophia's mind reached 0, and the world began to change in ways that Blake Morrison could never have imagined and would never be able to forget. The lesson was about to begin, and like all of Sophia's lessons, it would be swift, decisive, and absolutely definitive. The basement of the Cedar Falls Community Center transformed every Friday night into something that would have horrified the city council members who had approved its construction. What appeared during daylight hours as a wholesome venue for youth basketball and senior citizen aerobics became after midnight a cathedral of violence, where desperate people gathered to watch other desperate people destroy each other for money that couldn't be earned through legitimate means. Vincent Torres had discovered the location through the same network of connections that had brought him every venue over the past 15 years of organizing underground fights. The community center's night janitor, a former boxer named Carlos, who owed Vincent more favors than he could repay in a lifetime, had mentioned that the building's basement was isolated from neighboring structures, soundproofed by its original construction, and accessible through service entrances that avoided the main parking areas where police might notice unusual late-night activity. The transformation process began every Friday at 9 p.m., when Carlos would unlock doors that were supposed to remain sealed and disable security systems that were supposed to monitor everything. By 10 p.m., a crew of volunteers had moved folding chairs from storage rooms and arranged them in concentric circles around a space that had been measured and marked with surgical precision. By 11 p.m., temporary lighting had been installed to eliminate shadows that might obscure critical moments of violence. By midnight, the first spectators would begin arriving through entrances that most of them couldn't have found during daylight hours. Sophia Martinez had entered this world through a combination of desperation and calculated risk that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her as the quiet transfer student at Riverside High. The transition from grieving daughter trying to process her father's death to underground fighter earning money through controlled violence had taken place over months of careful preparation and increasingly dangerous experimentation with her own limitations. The initial contact had come through her father's former training partner, Miguel Santos, who had maintained connections to combat sports long after his own competitive career had ended in injury and disillusionment. Miguel had known Sophia since childhood, had watched her develop skills that exceeded those of most adult practitioners, had understood that her technical abilities were matched by an emotional control that made her psychologically suited for environments where fear could be fatal. When Sophia's family situation had become desperate enough that conventional solutions were inadequate, Miguel had mentioned Vincent Torres with the reluctance of someone revealing dangerous secrets to people he cared about. Vincent operated in gray areas where talented fighters could earn substantial money, but those gray areas were populated by individuals whose motivations ranged from merely questionable to genuinely evil. Miguel's introduction had come with warnings about maintaining anonymity, avoiding emotional attachments, and understanding that underground fighting was a business where success attracted attention from people who viewed violence as entertainment rather than necessity. Vincent Torres himself was a contradiction that Sophia had needed weeks to understand fully. His appearance suggested legitimate business success, with expensive suits and luxury accessories that spoke of income far beyond what a legal fight promotion should have provided. His manner was courteous and professional, treating fighters with the respect usually reserved for valued business partners rather than disposable commodities. His knowledge of combat sports was encyclopedic, demonstrating understanding of technical details that could only have come from years of serious study and practical experience. But Vincent's eyes carried the kind of coldness that Sophia had learned to associate with people who had crossed moral boundaries so often that they no longer recognized their existence. His courteous demeanor was a performance designed to maintain productive relationships, not an expression of genuine concern for the welfare of people who generated his income. His professional approach to illegal fight promotion was motivated by profit margins rather than sporting integrity, making him simultaneously the most reliable and most dangerous person in Sophia's expanding world. The business relationship between Vincent and Sophia had been negotiated with the complexity of any professional contract, though the terms were understood rather than written, and the enforcement mechanisms operated outside legal systems. Sophia would fight under the name The Phoenix to protect her real identity and maintain plausible deniability for everyone involved. She would be paid 50% of her fight purses immediately after each victory, with the remainder held in reserve to cover medical expenses, travel costs, and the various fees that Vincent charged for his promotional services. More importantly, Vincent would provide protection for Sophia's anonymity and safety that extended beyond the fighting venues themselves. Her real name would be known only to Vincent and his most trusted associates. Her personal information would be compartmentalized in ways that made it impossible for spectators or other fighters to track her to her civilian life. Her participation in underground circuits would be scheduled around her school obligations and family responsibilities, allowing her to maintain the fiction that she was succeeding through conventional teenage activities. The financial arrangements had been structured to provide maximum benefit while minimizing risk exposure. Sophia's fight purses were paid in cash through channels that avoided creating documentary evidence of her participation. The money was divided into portions that could be deposited into legitimate accounts without triggering reporting requirements, invested in educational savings accounts that suggested family planning rather than illegal income, and converted into prepaid cards that could cover medical expenses without requiring identification or financial documentation. Vincent's ability to provide these services reflected his understanding that successful underground fight promotion required infrastructure that extended far beyond simply arranging violent encounters. Fighters needed medical care that didn't ask questions about the origin of their injuries. They needed transportation that couldn't be traced to illegal venues. They needed financial services that could convert cash earnings into legitimate assets without creating audit trails that might expose the entire operation. The medical support available to Vincent's fighters represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of his organization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez operated a clinic that officially specialized in sports medicine but that actually served as a trauma center for people whose injuries couldn't be explained through conventional athletics. Elena had lost her license to practice in hospitals after being caught prescribing painkillers to patients who sold them for profit, but her surgical skills remained exceptional and her discretion was absolute. The clinic itself occupied the second floor of a building that housed legitimate businesses on the ground level, accessible through stairs that were designed to be overlooked by casual observers. Elena's equipment was state-of-the-art, despite the unofficial nature of her practice, purchased through medical supply companies that specialized in serving overseas markets where documentation requirements were less stringent. Her staff consisted of nurses who had been similarly excluded from mainstream medical practice, but who possessed skills that made them invaluable for treating injuries that conventional emergency rooms would have reported to law enforcement. Sophia's first visit to Elena's clinic had occurred after her third underground fight, when an opponent's desperate uppercut had opened a cut above her left eye that required stitches, but couldn't be explained to her mother without revealing the source of her injury. Elena had treated the wound with professional competence while asking no questions about its origin, demonstrating the kind of medical ethics that prioritized patient welfare over legal compliance. The psychological preparation required for underground fighting had proven more challenging than the physical conditioning that Sophia had developed through years of martial arts training. Learning to inflict serious harm on other people, even in structured combat situations where both participants had consented to violence, required mental adjustments that conflicted with everything she had been taught about conflict resolution and human relationships. Elena's clinic also provided informal counseling services for fighters who struggled with the emotional aftermath of their participation in underground circuits. The counselor, a former military psychologist named Dr. James Park, had lost his professional credentials after being caught treating veterans with experimental therapies that violated established protocols. His methods were unconventional but effective, helping fighters process the psychological impact of violence while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for continued success. Dr. Park's sessions with Sophia had focused on compartmentalization, techniques that allowed her to separate her identity as the Phoenix from her civilian life as a high school student. The skills he taught her were similar to those used by soldiers and law enforcement officers who needed to function effectively in violent situations, while returning to normal social interactions afterward. The goal was not to eliminate emotional responses to violence, but to control them in ways that preserved both her psychological health and her operational effectiveness. The training facilities available through Vincent's network represented another dimension of support that distinguished his operation from more amateur underground fighting promotions. Rather than forcing fighters to prepare in conventional gyms, where their activities might attract unwanted attention, Vincent had established relationships with private training centers that could be accessed outside normal business hours. The primary facility occupied a warehouse that had been converted into a comprehensive combat sports center, complete with multiple fighting surfaces, strength training equipment, and technical instruction from coaches who had worked with professional athletes before various scandals had ended their mainstream careers. The warehouse's location in an industrial district ensured privacy, while its irregular schedule of use made it difficult for law enforcement to establish surveillance patterns. Sophia's training regimen at the warehouse had been designed specifically to prepare her for the unique challenges of underground fighting, which differed significantly from conventional martial arts competition. Underground opponents were motivated by desperation rather than sporting achievement, making them willing to employ tactics that would have been considered unsportsmanlike in legitimate venues. The absence of referees meant that fights continued until one participant was physically incapable of continuing, requiring superior conditioning and pain tolerance. The psychological profiling of potential opponents represented one of Vincent's most valuable services to his fighters. Through networks of informants and careful observation of fighting patterns, Vincent could provide detailed analyses of upcoming opponents' technical capabilities, psychological weaknesses, and historical performance under different types of pressure. This intelligence allowed fighters like Sophia to develop specific strategies for individual matches rather than relying on generic approaches that might prove inadequate against particular types of adversaries. Vincent's information about Sophia's opponents had proven unnaturally accurate, suggesting access to sources that went beyond casual observation. He knew details about their training routines, personal motivations, financial pressures, and emotional states that could only have come from comprehensive surveillance or insider reporting. The ethical implications of this intelligence gathering were troubling, but the tactical advantages it provided were undeniable. The betting networks that surrounded underground fighting represented both opportunity and danger for participants. Like Sophia, Vincent's organization facilitated wagering that could multiply fight purses exponentially, but it also created incentives for match fixing and violence that extended beyond the fighting venues themselves. Fighters who consistently won against betting odds attracted attention from gambling syndicates that had methods of persuasion far more sophisticated than anything available to high school bullies. Sophia's success as the Phoenix had generated betting patterns that made her both valuable and vulnerable within these networks. Her consistent victories had established her as a favorite in matches, where her opponents were given significant odds advantages, creating situations where substantial amounts of money depended on her continued success. The pressure to maintain. Her winning streak extended beyond personal pride to include obligations to people who had invested heavily in her reputation. The anonymity that protected Sophia's civilian identity also created vulnerabilities that became more serious as her underground reputation grew. Her success as the Phoenix had attracted attention from promoters in other cities, who wanted to feature her in higher-stakes venues. These opportunities promised greater financial rewards, but also increased exposure to law enforcement, attention, and criminal elements that operated on scales far beyond Vincent's relatively small organization. The geographic expansion of Sophia's fighting career had required travel arrangements that maintained her anonymity, while accommodating her school schedule and family obligations. Vincent's organization provided transportation through networks of drivers who specialized in moving people without creating documentary evidence of their journeys. Hotels were booked under false names, and payments were made through prepaid accounts that couldn't be traced to their real sources. The most dangerous aspect of Sophia's double life was the constant risk that her two identities would intersect in ways that exposed her underground career to people who knew her as a high school student. The physical demands of fighting left. Injuries that had to be concealed through careful use of makeup and clothing. The emotional intensity of underground combat created psychological states that had to be managed to avoid attracting attention from teachers or classmates, who might recognize signs of trauma or unusual stress. The financial success that Sophia achieved through underground fighting had transformed her family circumstances in ways that required constant explanation and misdirection. Her sister's medical treatments were suddenly affordable through sources that had to be described as scholarship programs and community assistance rather than illegal earnings. Their apartment was upgraded to a better neighborhood through rental assistance that officially came from social services rather than underground fight purses. The scheduling demands of maintaining her fighting career while attending high school had required time management skills that bordered on superhuman. Fight venues operated on Friday and Saturday nights, requiring recovery periods that extended into Monday classes. Training sessions had to be compressed into hours when she should have been sleeping or studying. Travel to distant venues consumed entire weekends that officially were spent on family visits or school-related activities. The most psychologically challenging aspect of Sophia's double life was the complete inability to share her successes or struggles with anyone in her civilian world. Her victories in underground circuits were achievements that had to be celebrated in solitude. Her defeats and injuries were setbacks that had to be processed without support or understanding from friends or family members. The pride she felt in her technical development and competitive success was the emotion that couldn't be expressed or acknowledged. Vincent's organization had provided Sophia with a community of sorts, through relationships with other fighters who understood the unique pressures of maintaining underground careers while living conventional lives. But these relationships were constrained by the same anonymity requirements that protected everyone involved, making genuine friendship impossible even among people who shared similar experiences and challenges. The code names and aliases that fighters used extended beyond simple identity protection to create psychological distance that made violence more manageable for participants who retained moral sensibilities. Sophia could inflict serious harm on opponents when she thought of them as professional adversaries rather than individuals with families and futures. The Phoenix could employ techniques that Sophia Martinez would have found morally unacceptable, creating psychological compartmentalization that preserved her civilian identity while enabling her underground success. Standing in the courtyard at Riverside High, watching Blake Morrison prepare to destroy her backpack while 200 students recorded everything with their phones, Sophia felt the familiar sensation of worlds colliding in ways that threatened to expose everything she had worked to protect. The carefully maintained separation between her identities was about to be shattered by a teenage bully who had no understanding of the forces he was about to unleash. Blake Morrison had identified her backpack as a vulnerability because he understood teenage psychology but had no knowledge of underground psychology. The bag contained items that were precious to Sophia Martinez, the high school student, but it also contained evidence of the Phoenix's existence that could destroy Vincent's organization and expose everyone involved to criminal prosecution. Blake's threat to burn her possessions was simultaneously trivial and catastrophic, meaningless and existential. The decision that Sophia faced was not simply whether to submit to Blake's humiliation or resist his authority. She was choosing between preserving the anonymity that protected her family's financial security and revealing capabilities that would forever change her relationship with everyone at Riverside High. The quiet transfer student who had spent weeks hiding in plain sight was about to decide whether the time for hiding was over. The Phoenix had faced 23 opponents in underground venues where defeat meant hospitalization and victory meant survival. She had never lost a fight because she had never faced anyone who possessed the combination of technical skill, psychological control, and desperate motivation that she brought to every encounter. Blake Morrison was about to learn the difference between someone who fought for entertainment and someone who fought for family. The lighter in Kevin Walsh's hand flickered like a promise of destruction, but the real fire was already burning in Sophia's eyes as she calculated the exact sequence of movements that would transform her from victim to predator in the time it took Blake Morrison to realize that his carefully planned demonstration was about to become the catalyst for his own destruction. 200 phones were recording what their owners believed would be routine teenage cruelty, but they were actually about to capture the moment when an underground fighting legend stopped pretending to be a powerless high school student. The education of Blake Morrison was about to begin, and like all effective education, it would be swift, comprehensive, and permanently transformative. Blake Morrison raised his hand to signal the crowd, his voice cutting through the autumn air. With the practiced authority of someone who had orchestrated dozens of similar scenes. Listen up, everyone. Our new friend Sophia here seems to think her little bag is more important than showing proper respect to the people who actually matter at this school. His words carried the theatrical emphasis of someone playing to an audience that existed as much online as in person, every syllable calculated for maximum viral impact. The crowd pressed closer, their phones raised like weapons of documentation, sensing that Blake was building toward something spectacular. Ashley Kim had positioned herself strategically to capture multiple angles, while coordinating with other students through rapid text exchanges that ensured comprehensive coverage of whatever was about to unfold. The courtyard had transformed into a coliseum where 200 teenagers waited for blood in the form of digital humiliation that would follow Sophia Martinez for the rest of her academic career. So here's what's going to happen, Blake continued, his tone dropping to the dangerous register that had preceded every successful destruction of another student's dignity. I'm going to count down from 10. When I reach 0, Kevin lights this bag on fire unless Sophia gets on her knees and asks nicely for me to reconsider. He paused to let the term sink in, his smile widening as he watched her face for signs of the fear that always preceded capitulation. Kevin Walsh flicked his lighter with practiced ease, the flame dancing just inches below the worn leather that Blake held with theatrical care. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel, the threat of destruction hanging over possessions that obviously meant more to Sophia than Blake could have understood. Dylan Reed had positioned himself to block any potential escape route, while Ashley continued her silent coordination of the social media documentation that would transform this moment into permanent digital evidence of Blake's dominance. 10, Blake announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. The number hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on the assembled students who found themselves caught between horrified fascination and guilty excitement. Most had witnessed Blake's performances before, but the elaborate staging of this particular demonstration promised something more memorable than his usual casual cruelties. Sophia Martinez stood perfectly still in the center of the circle, her breathing controlled and rhythmic in ways that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with pre-fight preparation. Her eyes remained fixed on Blake's face rather than the threatened backpack, reading micro-expressions and body language with the analytical precision of someone who had learned that survival often depended on predicting an opponent's next move before they made it themselves. The internal countdown that Sophia maintained operated on a different timeline than Blake's theatrical performance. While he played to his audience and savored each moment of anticipated victory, she was calculating distances, evaluating threat levels, and preparing for the sequence of events that would follow her decision to stop hiding behind the fiction of helplessness. 23 underground victories had taught her that the most dangerous moments in any fight occurred when opponents believed they held overwhelming advantages. 9, Blake called out, his confidence building as Sophia failed to display the terror that should have accompanied the destruction of her treasured possessions. Her lack of visible fear was actually encouraging to him, suggesting that she was too shocked or overwhelmed to process the reality of her situation. In Blake's experience, the quiet ones broke the hardest when their facades finally crumbled, providing the most satisfying demonstrations of his power over people who thought they could resist his authority. The crowd's energy was building toward the crescendo that Blake had carefully orchestrated. Students who had arrived expecting routine lunch period entertainment found themselves witnessing something that felt more significant, a public execution of someone's dignity that would serve as both entertainment and education for everyone involved. The phones recording everything captured not just the immediate spectacle, but the faces of spectators who were learning valuable lessons about the consequences of challenging established hierarchies. Emma Chun shifted uncomfortably near the back of the crowd, her usual refuge in anonymity compromised by the moral complexity of what she was witnessing. Marcus Thompson found himself remembering his own encounters with Blake's systematic cruelty, the way each humiliation had felt like a small death that taught him to avoid any behavior that might attract similar attention. Other students who had survived Blake's targeting watched with the complicated emotions of people who understood both the relief of not being chosen and the guilt of allowing someone else to suffer in their place. 8, Blake announced, the number carrying additional weight as the countdown approached its inevitable conclusion. Kevin Walsh adjusted his grip on the lighter, preparing for the moment when Blake's signal would transform threat into action. The flame seemed to grow brighter in the afternoon shadows, a small sun that promised to consume whatever Blake deemed worthy of destruction. Sophia's phone buzzed in her pocket with the distinctive pattern that indicated a message from Vincent Torres. The timing was unfortunate but not surprising, given that Friday afternoon texts usually involved final preparations for weekend fight cards that required her confirmation of availability and readiness. The underground fighting world operated on schedules that didn't accommodate high school social dynamics, creating conflicts between her two identities that she had managed to navigate successfully until this moment. The message itself was brief but significant, informing her that tomorrow night's opponent had withdrawn due to injury and been replaced by someone whose reputation in underground circuits was both legendary and terrifying. Marcus the Destroyer. Williams was a former professional heavyweight who had been banned from legitimate competition after testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs that had been specifically designed to increase pain tolerance and aggressive behavior. His underground career was built on a combination of superior technique and complete disregard for his opponent's long-term health. 7, Blake called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine excitement as he approached the climax of his carefully planned performance. The crowd responded with increased attention, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be discussed and analyzed long after the immediate entertainment value had faded. Social media notifications were already beginning to multiply, as early footage began circulating through networks that extended far beyond Riverside High's student body. The financial implications of tomorrow night's fight created additional pressure that Blake Morrison could never have understood. Marcus Williams commanded purses that reflected his reputation for ending careers rather than simply winning matches. A victory against him would establish the Phoenix as a legitimate contender for championship-level fights that paid enough money to secure Sophia's family's financial future permanently. A defeat would likely result in injuries serious enough to end her underground career while leaving her sister's medical needs unmet. The choice that Sophia faced was not simply between submitting to Blake's humiliation or revealing her hidden capabilities. She was choosing between preserving the anonymity that protected her underground career and exposing herself in ways that might eliminate her ability to earn the money that kept her sister alive. The quiet transfer student who had spent weeks hiding her true nature was being forced to decide whether her family's survival was worth more than her carefully constructed double life. 6, Blake announced, his satisfaction evident as Sophia continued to stand motionless rather than begging for mercy or attempting the futile resistance that would justify escalating his demonstration into more serious violence. Her stillness was being interpreted as paralysis by the crowd, confirmation that even mysterious transfer students were ultimately subject to the same social laws that governed everyone else at Riverside High. Ashley Kim's coordination of the social media documentation had reached peak efficiency, with dozens of students streaming live footage through platforms that guaranteed immediate and permanent circulation. The hashtags she had prepared weeks earlier were already trending locally, creating digital momentum that would ensure Blake's demonstration reached audiences far beyond the physical boundaries of Cedar Falls. The viral potential of comprehensive bullying documentation had become a science that Ashley had mastered through years of practice and refinement. Dylan Reed's positioning as crowd control had evolved into something more complex as he found himself studying Sophia's reaction with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that contradicted his understanding of how these situations were supposed to unfold. His own humiliating encounter with her in the hallway had been dismissed as accidental, but her complete lack of fear in this obviously threatening situation suggested possibilities that he was reluctant to consider seriously. 5, Blake called out, the number carrying additional significance as the countdown passed its halfway point toward inevitable conclusion. Kevin Walsh's lighter flame seemed to grow more intense, fed by his anticipation of the moment when Blake's signal would transform theatrical threat into actual destruction. The smell of butane mixed with autumn air created an atmosphere that was simultaneously festive and ominous. The internal countdown that governed Sophia's decision-making process was approaching its own critical threshold. Her experience in underground fighting had taught her that the most successful fighters were those who could remain calm while opponents lost emotional control. But it had also taught her that hesitation in decisive moments could be fatal. The mathematical precision with which she had managed her double life was about to be tested by circumstances that required choosing between competing priorities that were both essential to her survival. Vincent Torres represented not just financial opportunity, but also the infrastructure that had allowed Sophia to transform desperate circumstances into manageable ones. His organization provided medical care, legal protection, financial services, and operational security that enabled underground fighters to operate with acceptable levels of risk. Exposing her true capabilities at Riverside High would likely end her relationship with Vincent and eliminate her access to the resources that had made her family's survival possible. 4, Blake announced, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had never been forced to back down from any threat he had ever made. The crowd's energy reached fever pitch as they sensed the approaching climax of the demonstration they had been promised. The phones recording everything captured not just the immediate spectacle, but the expressions of anticipation and guilty excitement that characterized audiences who were about to witness someone else's destruction. But Sophia Martinez was no longer calculating the costs of revealing her true nature. She was remembering her sister's face during their last hospital visit. The way medical equipment had made her look smaller and more fragile than any 12-year-old should ever appear. She was thinking about the experimental treatment that offered the only hope for long-term survival, the treatment that required money that could only be earned through underground fighting, that demanded her continued anonymity. 3. Blake called out, the number reverberating through the courtyard like a bell tolling for someone's social execution. Kevin Walsh raised the lighter closer to the backpack, preparing for the signal that would transform weeks of planning into viral documentation of Blake Morrison's continued dominance over anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. The decision crystallized in Sophia's mind with the clarity that always preceded her most decisive moments in underground fighting venues. Blake Morrison was threatening to destroy possessions that could be replaced, but he was also threatening to expose evidence that could destroy lives that couldn't be rebuilt. The Phoenix had faced opponents who were stronger, faster, and more experienced, but she had never faced anyone who was stupider. 2. Blake announced, his smile widening as he prepared for the climactic moment that would cement his reputation while destroying Sophia's dignity. The crowd held its collective breath, phones steady and recording, witnessing what they believed would be routine teenage cruelty, but what was actually about to become the catalyst for Blake Morrison's education in the difference between performed violence and the real thing. Sophia Martinez looked at Blake Morrison with the same analytical calm that had preceded 23 consecutive victories in venues where losing meant more than social embarrassment. She thought about her sister, about Vincent Torres, about Marcus Williams, and about the choice between hiding and surviving. Then she did something that Blake Morrison had never seen in 3 years of systematically destroying other students' lives. She smiled. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.